The alarms tore through Outpost Ilsedri before I had even finished stepping off the landing ramp, and I knew, in the way a ruler always knows, that something had gone terribly wrong. Red light washed over the corridor walls. Kasari staff were running, not walking, their long limbs folding awkwardly as they gripped the walls for support. One young officer collapsed in front of me, his hands pressed against his own throat as if something inside him was trying to escape. I stepped over him because I had no idea yet what I was looking at, and because behind me, my guards were already shouting for a medical team that would not arrive in time for most of the people in that corridor. I am Queen Mother Yisanar Kolveth of the Kasari hegemony, and I had come to this remote station for a quiet, private reason. I had not expected to walk into a building that was killing its own people. My son Denric found me before I found him. He grabbed my arm, his face pale in a way I had never seen on him, and he said only one thing. Emma is in labor, and the Heir itself is trying to stop the baby from being born. I did not understand him fully in that moment, but I understood enough to run. We reached the medical bay through corridors littered with collapsed staff, some of them still breathing, some of them not moving at all. I made myself keep walking. A queen who stops for every fallen soldier never reaches the battle that matters most, and I already sensed that whatever was happening here was bigger than any one life, even mine. Inside the medical bay, a human woman named Emma Whitlock lay on a narrow bed, her face soaked in sweat, gripping the rails so hard her knuckles had gone white. She was a xenobiologist, stationed here for 3 years studying atmospheric samples, and somewhere in that time she had fallen in love with my son, and he with her. I had known none of this until an hour ago. Now I was watching her give birth in the middle of what looked like a mass poisoning. A physician named Callum Reyes, one of the few Kasari doctors still standing, was shouting orders at panicked assistants. He looked up at me only once, just long enough to say words that would haunt me for the rest of my reign. This is not sickness, Your Grace. This is a weapon. Someone released it through the air system. It is targeting genetic markers. It is only killing the ones of us who are pure. I felt the floor tilt beneath me even though it had not moved at all. A young technician stumbled past us, gripping the doorframe, her breath coming in short, ragged pulls. She was one of ours, born into a registered noble line 3 generations deep, and I watched her slide down the wall until she sat on the floor, her eyes wide and confused, as if her own body had turned into something she no longer recognized. Denric moved to help her, but Rhea stopped him with a sharp word. Do not touch her skin without gloves. We do not yet know how this spreads. That single sentence told me how little control anyone in that room actually had. A Kasari physician, trained for decades, admitting in front of his queen mother that he did not understand the very thing killing his own patients. Pure. That word had been the foundation of Kasari society for 10,000 years. Bloodlines ranked, catalogued, protected. Purity meant strength. Purity meant the right to rule, to command, to matter. I had built my entire understanding of my people around that single idea, and now that same idea was the reason bodies were falling in the hallway outside. Denric knelt beside Emma, holding her hand, whispering something to her that I could not hear over the alarms. She screamed, not from fear but from the raw effort of bringing a child into the worst possible moment to be born. And I stood there, queen mother of an empire, utterly useless, because none of my rank or my armies could do anything for her in that room. Dr. Reyes moved fast, faster than I had ever seen a Kasari physician move, because he understood something the rest of the station had not yet grasped. If the weapon was killing pure Kasari, and Emma was fully human, then the child she carried was neither one nor the other. Nobody in that room knew what would happen when that child took her first breath into an atmosphere built to hunt down genetic purity. I did not have time to be afraid for myself. I only had time to be afraid for the 2 people in front of me, and the small life about to arrive between them. The birth was fast, faster than Reyes expected. And when the child finally came into the world, she did not cry the weak, thin cry of a newborn overwhelmed by everything around her. She screamed with a fury that shook something loose in my chest, a sound so strong it cut straight through the noise of the alarms, and for one terrible second I thought the sound itself might be the last thing wrong with her. But she kept breathing. She kept screaming, and nothing in that room killed her. Reyes checked her vitals with trembling hands, running scans that beeped and blinked in patterns he clearly did not expect. Around us, station staff outside the medical bay were still collapsing, their bodies reacting violently to whatever had been released into the air. Inside the room, this small, furious child breathed the same air and thrived on it. I need her isolated, Reyes said, half to himself, half to the room. I need to understand what is happening in her blood, before I understand what happened to everyone else. Denric would not let her go. He held his daughter against his chest, refusing to release her even when Reyes reached for the scanning cradle, and Emma, exhausted and barely conscious, still managed to reach out and press her palm against the baby's back, as if to remind everyone in that room whose daughter this truly was. I stepped forward and did something I rarely do. I asked, instead of ordered. "Let the doctor work, Denrick. If she can help us understand this weapon, she may save every life left on this station." My son looked at me the way he had never looked at me before, not with obedience, but with something closer to trust, and he allowed Reyes to take the child for just long enough to run the tests that would change everything I believed about my own species. While Reyes worked, I stepped outside the medical bay to see the true scope of the disaster. The corridor was a scene I will never fully describe, because some memories are better carried in silence than spoken aloud. What I will say is this: every collapsed body in that hallway belonged to someone whose bloodline had been considered pure, protected, superior. The weapon had not touched a single member of the maintenance crew who came from mixed heritage generations back. It had not touched the 2 engineers whose families had quietly intermarried outside the noble registries decades ago. It had gone straight for the very traits my people had spent 10,000 years refining, and it had used those traits as a target. Someone on my own council had authorized this. I did not know who yet, but I knew with total certainty that whoever had done this believed they were protecting the hegemony from the shame of a half-human heir. They had built a weapon to remove the threat before it was born, and they had murdered their own people in the process, because purity, once perfected past a certain point, becomes fragile in ways its architects never predicted. I returned to the medical bay to find Reyes staring at his readings with an expression I can only describe as disbelief mixed with something like hope. "Your Grace," he said, "you need to see this." He showed me 2 sets of data side by side. One belonged to a Kasari noble who had died in the corridor less than an hour earlier, his blood chemistry a perfect, textbook example of pure lineage, refined over centuries to be efficient, elegant, and completely unable to adapt when the weapon attacked it. The other belonged to my granddaughter, barely an hour old, her blood chemistry a chaotic, redundant, seemingly inefficient mess by every standard Kasari science had ever used to measure genetic quality. And yet she was alive. She was thriving. Her small body had responded to the exact same airborne agent that had killed grown men and women twice her weight in strength, and it had simply adapted around the threat the way water finds a path around a stone. Reyes explained it to me slowly, the way you explain something to a person who has spent her whole life believing the opposite. Human biology, he said, carries backup systems, redundant pathways, traits that seem wasteful, inefficient, unnecessary, right up until the moment something unexpected happens, and then those same traits become the only thing standing between survival and collapse. Kasari biology had been refined for so long, chasing an ideal of perfect efficiency, that we had slowly bred out exactly the kind of flexibility that lets a body improvise under pressure. He pulled up a second chart, this one tracking how fast her small body was clearing the toxin from her blood, compared to the adult samples taken from the corridor. Her numbers climbed steadily upward, a clean, steady curve of recovery, while the samples beside hers flattened out, stalled, or dropped entirely. He tapped the screen twice, quietly, as if he needed to convince himself the numbers were real before he could say them out loud again. "Whatever this weapon does," he said, "it is looking for a kind of order that simply is not there in her blood. It searches for a pattern, and finds none clean enough to lock onto. It is like throwing a key at a lock that keeps changing shape." I asked him how long he needed to build something the rest of the station could use. He looked at Emma, still pale on the bed but conscious now, and then at the small, quiet bundle in Denrick's arms. "Give me 2 hours, and give me her blood," he said. "Not much, just enough." Denrick hesitated only a moment before nodding. My granddaughter was not a weaker version of a Kasari child. She was not some deluded, compromised bloodline to be quietly managed and hidden from court. She carried both systems at once, our precision and Emma's stubborn, adaptable strength, and in the middle of a crisis built specifically to punish purity, that combination was the only thing in the entire station immune to the weapon meant to destroy her before she ever took a breath. I sat down beside Emma's bed, my legs suddenly unwilling to hold the full weight of what I had just learned, and I watched Denrick hold his daughter while Reyes rushed out to begin treating the survivors in the corridor with information drawn directly from her blood. It took hours to stabilize the station. Reyes and his team, working from what they had learned inside that one small body, developed a countermeasure fast enough to save nearly everyone who had not already succumbed to the initial attack. Word spread through the station before I had even finished processing it myself. The child born in the middle of a crisis meant to erase her had become the reason half the station's staff would walk out of that day alive. I did not sleep that night. I sat in a private room aboard my cruiser, staring at nothing, turning over every belief I had built my rule upon. I had spent 111 cycles as Queen Mother, convinced that strength lived in bloodlines, in careful breeding, in the quiet, ruthless protection of an idea we called purity. I had watched that idea nearly destroy an entire outpost in a single afternoon, all because someone believed a half-human child was a threat worth killing an untold number of innocent people to prevent. By morning, I had learned the truth of who authorized the weapon. 3 members of my own council, men who had served the hegemony for decades, had quietly arranged for the station's air systems to be seeded with the agent the moment they learned of Emma's pregnancy. They had believed they were saving the hegemony from disgrace. Instead, they had become the clearest, bloodiest proof that everything they believed about their own superiority was a lie. I summoned the eldest of the 3, a counselor named Halden Vosk, to my cruiser before I even returned to the capital. He stood in front of me with none of the pride I remembered from decades of court sessions, only a tired, brittle stillness, as if he already knew there was nothing left to argue. I asked him a single question. Did you know how many of our own people would fall in that corridor before the child ever took her first breath? He said he had believed the agent would only ever need to trigger once, quietly, before the birth. He said he never expected it to spread through the station's shared air system and strike anyone else. He said this as if it excused him, and I told him plainly that it did not, that a weapon released into a building full of people is never quiet, and never limited to the one target its architect imagines. I did not have them executed. I have ruled long enough to know that fear alone does not fix a broken system, and killing 3 frightened old men would not undo 10,000 years of a belief that had just nearly wiped out an entire station. Instead, I stripped them of rank, publicly, in front of the full court, and I made certain every noble family in the hegemony understood exactly why. 20 days after the birth, I stood before the full hegemony court for the first time since returning from Outpost Il Cedri. My granddaughter, small and calm now, slept in my arms as I addressed a room full of nobles who had spent their entire lives believing exactly what I once believed. I told them the truth, plainly, without the careful diplomatic language I usually reserve for that chamber. I told them that a weapon built to protect our purity had instead exposed how fragile that purity truly was. I told them that the very traits we had spent centuries removing from our bloodlines, the messy, redundant, inefficient traits we considered beneath us, were the same traits that let a body survive when the rules stopped applying. I told them that a child not yet 1 month old had done what our best physicians, our finest breeding programs, and our proudest noble houses had failed to do. She had survived the unsurvivable, and in doing so, she had saved the very people who might have preferred she never existed at all. I told them I had expected an heir. I told them I had received something far better. Some of the older nobles looked away when I said it. A few, the younger ones, the ones who had grown up hearing whispered stories about the frontier stations and the quiet mixing of bloodlines that already existed far more widely than the court liked to admit, looked at my granddaughter with something closer to curiosity than disgust. One young noblewoman seated near the back of the chamber stood before I had even finished speaking. She said her own grandfather had come from a mixed line hidden 3 generations back, a fact her family had buried out of fear rather than shame, and she asked, quietly but clearly enough for the whole chamber to hear, whether such families would finally be allowed to speak their own history without punishment. I told her yes, and I watched several other nobles shift in their seats, some uncomfortable, some visibly relieved, as if a weight they had carried in silence for years had finally been given permission to set itself down. I named her heir to the hegemony that day. Not because I felt sentimental, though I will admit some sentiment crept into my voice as I spoke, but because I have spent over a century learning to recognize real strength, and I had spent that entire century measuring it wrong. Denrick stood beside me as I made the announcement, Emma beside him, both of them exhausted but steady, and when my granddaughter opened her eyes and looked out at the court that had almost erased her before she was born, I felt something shift in that ancient chamber that I do not think will ever fully shift back. In the weeks that followed, I ordered every noble bloodline registry in the hegemony reopened for review. Families who had hidden mixed heritage out of fear were no longer required to hide it. Physicians across our worlds were instructed to study human biology, not to imitate it, but to understand what our own refinement had cost us along the way. It will take generations to undo what 10,000 years of careful, prideful breeding created, but I believe now that it must be undone, piece by piece, the same way my granddaughter's small, chaotic, powerful blood undid it in a single afternoon. Outpost Il Cedri has since become something of a quiet pilgrimage site among younger Kasari, not because of tragedy, though the losses that day were real and are remembered, but because it marks the place where an old, brittle idea finally broke apart under the weight of its own failure. Dr. Reyes remains stationed there by his own request, leading a small team dedicated entirely to studying how human and Kasari biology work together rather than apart. He sends me reports twice a cycle now, much like the ones my son once sent, only these are filled with genuine discovery instead of quiet efficiency. He tells me the redundant pathways we once considered wasteful are showing up in every hybrid case his team studies, and every time, they behave the same way they did in my granddaughter, quiet until they are needed, and then absolutely decisive. Emma has stayed on the station as well, though her work has changed. She no longer studies distant atmospheric samples. She teaches, now, a growing handful of young Kasari physicians who travel from every part of the hegemony to learn what she has always understood instinctively about her own species, the same understanding that once seemed so far beneath our notice. I am Queen Mother Yisanar Kolvith, and I ruled for over a century believing that strength meant purity, that greatness meant careful, controlled bloodlines free of anything unexpected. I was wrong, and I learned it from a child who was never supposed to exist, born in a room built specifically to prove she should not, who survived it anyway and then saved the very people who tried to make sure she never would. She sleeps now in a nursery guarded not because anyone still fears what she represents, but because she is, quite simply, the future of my people, human blood and all. When she is old enough to understand the story of the day she was born, I will tell her myself, plainly, the way I have learned to tell the truth since that day. I will tell her that her grandmother once believed the wrong things for a very long time, and that she, more than any general or physician or noble house, was the one who finally taught me better. I had expected an heir. I received a future.